morally equivalent. There is no morally defensible reason to continue this practice. And it is also highly discriminatory because we are not saying that not all lives matter. We are saying some lives matter less than others. And this is a practice that disproportionately affects migrant workers. And this framing is imposed on us such that we continue to argue in very circular fashion, right? But it is not equivalent. So when we say loss of human lives, you cannot say acute pain by acute pain of finance businesses. They are not the same.
Yeah. Very, Jaya, do you want to add more to that?
Yeah, thanks so much for everyone's comments so far. I think picking up on what Stephanie has said, I'll just maybe take us through a little bit of what exactly the legislation says and why is it that, migrant workers are the class or demographic of people that are disproportionately affected by this law, and what have been some of the legislative changes that have happened over the years and why they are still insufficient. So basically the Road Traffic Act, as a blanket rule, does prohibit people from being transported on goods lorries. But there is an exception to this rule. And so the exception says that any person who is carried in the employment of the owner or the hirer of the vehicle. So basically, if you're working for the person who owns that particular vehicle, you can be transported on the back of the goods lorry. Alright? So this means that anyone who is in that employment can be transported in this way. Subject to, of course, certain safety rules that are also found within the Road Traffic Act. But obviously, when we look at the class of workers that, migrant workers, there are over 300,000 of them who are working in Singapore, so naturally it would fall on, the lower wage workers who are going to be transported in this way, which in Singapore would be the migrant workers. And another thing is that the Foreign Employment Dormitories Act actually mandates that employers are supposed to provide the transportation for these dormitory residents to the work sites. Okay, so and of course these are all migrant workers as well. So when you add that layer to this existing legislation, this existing law, that is the Road Traffic Act, this is how we come to this situation where it is disproportionately the migrant workers who are transported on the backs of lorries. So, on the face of it, the Road Traffic Act may not look discriminatory because you're saying that, hey, any kind of worker may be transported on the backs of lorries. But when you apply this in practice, when you consider all these other factors that sort of push a certain group of people to be treated in a certain way, then the law in practice, of course, becomes discriminatory, as Stephanie has pointed out. And of course, over the years, there have been many calls and even in Parliament, there's been so many discussions about how we can make things better. But of course, we have fallen short of just removing these laws that cause these very unsafe and discriminatory practices to happen in the first place. So for example, in 2010, there was a slew of migrant worker deaths that happened as a result of them being transported on the backs of lorries. So what did we do? We increased the railing height on the sides of the lorries. We said that there has to be canopies that, so that the migrant workers are protected from the elements. But as the lady pointed out, these are not foolproof. Even with the canopies, you still feel the rain, you still feel the pollution. Even with the railings on the side, when you're moving, you're still hitting the front, the back, there are still equipment, on all four sides around you. These are not foolproof methods at all. This year, during the budget debate, there was even more calls, to make changes to the law to ensure that our migrant workers are transported in a safe way. And this came at the back of the accidents that Javon mentioned in April 2021. So what are some of the changes that have been proposed? They haven't come into law yet, but in Parliament what was discussed was that we're going to have speed management devices for all lorries, which means to say there are speed limiters that prevent lorries from going past a certain speed like it's just going to be worked into the mechanism of the lorry. Caps on working hours for those who are drivers come workers. I know there are many people who actually double up, work as drivers and then they have to go to do their work and then they have to be drivers again. So this is caps on working hours on top of what is already going to be there in the Employment Act. And thirdly, there's going to be a designated person in charge who has to sort of sit next to the driver to make sure, he's driving safely and all of that. It's good that we're trying to be as creative as possible in trying to tackle these issues, but what we are essentially doing is still to apportion individual responsibility on what is essentially a systemic issue, right? So because if a person, for example, who is sitting next to a lorry driver is found to have not done his job properly, then the law can come in and penalize him for doing a rash act or an unsafe act or a negligent act. In fact, when we hear of all these accidents that happen on the road, we see the last line of the newspaper article is always saying, oh, a 38-year-old man is now assisting police with investigation. So we are still it's something that we are saying, it falls to the individual to make sure that, the safety regulations are complied with and so on and so forth. But how can a person go up against a mode of transportation that is inherently unsafe, right? So I think that's something that we need to think about. Probably where I will end on this part is that I think there was I think Zeleni very rightfully mentioned that this is an issue which continuously requires a spotlight, because when it's people and Singaporeans who are passionate about this issue and they want the change to happen, and we keep speaking up about it and we keep asking the questions as to what exactly is the cost we're talking about, what exactly are the barriers that we're facing to just do away with these kinds of discriminatory practices that eventually change might happen.
So, thanks.